Bought Manchester City in 2002. Bought Mero in 2003. Xiao Luo's secret to buying people is only one. I have money. What fiscal equity bill? You can't control me now. Only money is the only way to get around in football. Sorry, the inflation in football starts from me. Chapter 1. Empty people. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Xiao Luo is very empty. He is very wealthy now, but he has lost his happiness. At the age of 17, he became a glorious rebirth. The following year, his adoptive father, American John Lehman, passed away, leaving him with a considerable fortune. Although he was stripped of most of it by other members of the Lehman family, he ultimately left behind $1 million. And in that summer, the 1996 European Championship officially opened. As a seasoned fan, Xiao Luo naturally knows the results of these matches. In the end, he relied on gambling and successfully increased his wealth to $5 million. Then, he began to study at Stanford University. On the university campus, he found Larry Page and Sergey Brin, who are still pursuing a PhD in computer science. These two ordinary-looking technical men never thought that they would become billionaires in the future, but Xiao Luo knew how much impact these two men would bring to the internet world in the future. So when these two tech men were just starting their careers, he decisively invested $500,000 and obtained 60% equity in their company. Of course, he was very self-aware and gave up his decision-making power, receiving the right to priority dividends. By the way, the company they founded is called Google. Then he invested the remaining money into the stock market, of which $2 million bought Apple stocks and $2 million was set aside for Nasdaq index futures. He clearly remembered that before 2000, there was a very scary internet foam in the US stock market, and he wanted to seize this wave and expand his wealth rapidly. Throughout his college years, he remained very low-key, but his wealth rapidly grew exponentially. By the way, during the summer vacation when his junior year ended, he went back to China. He first went to Hangzhou and found a man surnamed Ma who was not very good looking, ready to do venture capital for him. However, this old comrade Ma is really deceiving. Originally, he only wanted to invest $5 million in him, but this person actually forcefully demanded $10 million from him with his eloquent tongue. However, Comrade Ma also paid a price of 20% of the shares. After finishing everything, Xiao Luo ran to Shenzhen and found a classmate named Xiaoma who was developing a chat software. Now Xiaoma is feeling worried about not having enough money to expand the server and is preparing to sell this chat software for 600,000 yuan. And Xiao Luo decisively took out 1 million RMB to help him solve the urgent situation, and successfully obtained 50% equity in this company. Of course, he still did not request a controlling stake in the company. He only needs money. After making these two venture capital investments, he returned to the United States. At this time, American internet companies continued to soar, and the Nasdaq index also continued to hit new highs. The assets in his account soared like a rocket. Due to the leverage of stock index futures, in the last semester of his senior year, his earnings from stock index futures alone had already reached $100 million. Then, after the Nasdaq index broke through 5,000 points, he began to gradually close his positions and take profits. He also decisively sold off Apple's stock, which had already doubled tenfold. In the midst of market frenzy, he chose to short. He took out half of his wealth and gradually started building short positions, becoming one of the largest bears in the market. Sure enough, after bursting the internet foam, the Nasdaq index began to plummet. It took 2 years to drop from 500 points to about 1,000 points. This huge empty order has directly boosted Xiao Luo's wealth to $500 million. After clearing the warehouse, he looked at the 9 figures in his account and suddenly felt a bit empty in his heart. It is now November 2002, and I have been reborn in the United States for 7 years. Apart from earning this money, he has not gained anything else in the past 7 years. Moreover, after graduating from university, he did not choose to work, which made him a useless existence in the eyes of others. He sighed, "This is definitely not acceptable. You must find something to do for yourself." Coincidentally, a Premier League game is currently playing on TV. This is a Manchester derby. At this time, Manchester City has not yet been bought by the Chiefs, and even Thaksin has not started to take control. Nowadays, they are still a typical team in the middle and lower reaches of the English Premier League, which is completely different from the red shirt powerhouse in the same city. However, Manchester City at this time also has reasons for Xiao Luo's concern. Because Chinese player Sun Jihai joined the team at the beginning of this year. He also opened a paid channel for Sky Sports specifically to follow Premier League matches. In this game, Sun Jihai started. I thought that General Fan, Sun Jihai, and Tai Zi were the beginning of going abroad, but I didn't expect this to be the peak. 20 years later, not to mention the overseas players who play as main players in the English Premier League, even going abroad is half sold and half given away. At the thought of this, Xiao Luo couldn't help but sigh. Although he holds American citizenship now, he is still a Chinese in his soul. Of course, originally this body was also from China. He was a child adopted directly by John Lehman in China, when he was only 11 years old. Later, it was discovered that his parents had once saved John Lehman in China, so after his parents died unexpectedly, John Lehman immediately came to China to adopt him. However, although this adoptive father is very kind to him, almost everyone else in the Lehman family is very indifferent to him. Because of this, he has been attending boarding school since high school. Until the death of their foster father, members of the Lehman family led by their foster mother cleared themselves out of the family. For this result, he doesn't have any special emotions. After all, he doesn't have much sense of belonging to this family. He just often goes to see his adoptive father and chat with him. Just as he was overthinking, a sudden change occurred on the field. The game had only been going on for 5 minutes, and a nil cartoon made a comeback shot and knocked open Manchester United's goal. Originally, this French genius was expected to achieve even higher accomplishments, but frequent team changes and insatiable agents ruined his career. So he, who once shone in Arsenal and Real Madrid, can only devote himself to Manchester City, a mid to lower tier team, at the age of 23. But Manchester City's excitement didn't last long. 3 minutes later, the rare starting Solskjaer helped Manchester United successfully equalize the score. Xiao Luo suddenly became interested. It seems like this could be a big goal battle. After Manchester City was equalized, they did not panic, but instead stabilized their pace and continued to entangle with Manchester United. Manchester City has been in good form this season and has now achieved 2 consecutive wins. In this game, they have continued their good form and even suppressed Manchester United at one point. And their positive attitude ultimately paid off, with Goth scoring 2 goals in the 26th and 50th minutes. Manchester City defeated the powerful Manchester United 3-1 at home. Coach Kevin Keegan bared his big teeth and shook hands with the old man with a red nose chewing gum, then joined the celebratory crowd of players. Sun Jihai played the entire game and performed admirably. At the age of 25, he is gradually reaching the pinnacle of his career. Xiao Luo believes that if it weren't for his injury, he could have played longer at Manchester City. And this is also the last Manchester derby played at Main Road Stadium. At the end of this season, the stadium that has accompanied Manchester City for 80 years will be demolished, and the main stadium of Manchester City will be moved to Manchester City Football Stadium. Watching Manchester City players passionately interacting with fans, Xiao Luo suddenly had an idea. How about I go by Manchester City to play? Chapter 2 3 Virtues. Getting extra money. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As soon as he thought of this, he felt his blood boil all over. Nowadays, I also have a lot of money, and I have invested in Google, Alibaba, and Tencent, which are the 3 cash cows. If I don't arrange a place for them with so much money, I'm really sorry for our face. Don't be fooled by the fact that these $500 million in one's own account may not be worth much in 20 years, but in today's era, they are too valuable. Let me put it this way, the current king is still Zidane's $64 million, which is enough to buy 8 Zidans. And 6 years later, Thaksin only spent over £80 million to buy a controlling stake in Manchester City. But now he can't just go to the entrance of Manchester City Club to make a purchase, he needs to find a helper. So he decisively bought a plane ticket and went to England. After going to England, he found JP Chase's Manchester branch. He didn't mean to entrust them to help with the acquisition, but directly said, "I want to find your senior manager, Ed Woodward." The front desk was a very beautiful young girl who politely said, "Sir, do you have an appointment?" Xiao Luo shook his head and said, "I don't have an appointment." The front desk asked again, "Sir, may I ask if you have anything to do with Mr. Woodward?" Xiao Luo said, "I want to negotiate a business deal with him." The front desk hesitated for a moment and said, "Okay, just a moment. I'll contact Mr. Woodward first." Xiao Luo nodded. After making a phone call, the front desk politely said, "Sir, please follow me." So she led Xiao Luo to a small conference room, poured him a glass of water, and then twisted her hips to leave the room. Xiao Luo couldn't help but marvel at her exceptional talent, and then saw Woodward walking through the door. This legendary figure, known as the Three Virtues by Manchester United fans in later generations, is still just a staff member of JP Chase. Although he is just in his 30s, his hair has a traditional trend of British men. As Xiao Luo remembered, his round face had a pair of big eyes, and his overall appearance was quite comical. However, Xiao Luo knew that although this product was highly criticized in the football field, his commercial development skills were excellent. If we invite him to join, there will be no problem with the commercial development of the club. As long as he is not allowed to interfere in the competitive aspect. Yes, Xiao Luo came here to recruit Sandezi. Sandezi looked at this overly young Eastern face and suddenly felt a little confused. He tentatively said, "Sir, what can I do for you?" Xiao Luo looked at him and said, "Mr. Woodward, my name is Xiao Luo. I want you to help me buy Manchester City Club." Sandezi was stunned, looked at Xiao Luo carefully, and asked tentatively, "Mr. Yang, which Manchester City Club are you talking about?" Xiao Luo was also stunned. "How many Manchester City clubs are there?" Sandiko smiled sheepishly, still a little incredulous. "Is it Manchester City Football Club?" Xiao Luo naturally said, "Yes." Sandezi trembled all over and carefully scrutinized Xiao Luo. This person also looks polite and somewhat handsome, not like he has a mental problem. So he asked tentatively. "Mr. Yang, the market value of Manchester City Football Club now exceeds £80 million. Are you sure you want to buy it?" Xiao Luo glanced at him and said, "Mr. Woodward, do you think I came all this way from the United States to joke with you?" Speaking, he directly took out an asset certificate from his bag. Sandezi's eyes widened as he looked at the string of numbers on it. He couldn't help but take a sip of water and quickly said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Yang, I was impolite." Xiao Luo was too lazy to argue with him. "Do you know anything about Manchester City Club?" Sandiko sighed and said, "To be honest, my father is a staunch Manchester United fan." Xiao Luo glanced at him and said, "Aren't you willing to take on this business deal?" Sandezi immediately smiled and said, "How could that be? I am a professional investment manager, and solving clients' demands is our job." Xiao Luo nodded and said, "Okay, I hope to see your acquisition plan within 3 days." Sandezi's work efficiency is still very fast. In just 1 day, Xiao Luo received his call. He has already communicated with the owner of Manchester City, John Waddell, who is open to selling ownership of Manchester City. Xiao Luo can't help but understand this attitude. This big brother is just waiting for the price to sell. So he said directly to Sandiko, "What is Mr. Wardell's asking price?" Sandetsi said, £100 million. Yang Luo smiled but didn't speak. John Wardell now holds 68% of Manchester City's shares, while his friend David Martin holds 25% of the shares. For a club with a valuation of only £80 million, his asking price is obviously too high. However, he knew that Sandesi could not directly pass on such an outrageous price to him, so he was waiting for Sandesi's follow-up. Sure enough, Sandesi continued, "But I have already helped Mr. Yang communicate with Mr. Wardell, and he is willing to lower his asking price." Yang Luo didn't listen to his teasing and said, "What is his asking price now?" Sandetsi said, "Mr. Wardell is willing to sell his shares for around £70 million. This price is about 20% higher than the estimated value, but it is also close to a reasonable range." So Yang Luo said directly, "I'll give you £90 million. Sandesi was taken aback. Why did he still add more money? Yang Luo smiled and said, £90 million is the price for acquiring all the shares in Manchester City. Sandetsi finally understood. Yang Luo said again, "As for how much you can talk about, that's your skill, and the extra part can be used as your performance compensation." Upon hearing this, Sandetsi was overjoyed and said, "Okay, Mr. Yang, wait for my good news." Hanging up the phone, Yang Luo began to calculate. In fact, £90 million is his reasonable valuation in his mind. After all, Manchester City does not have particularly significant operational risks now, and acquiring it would require bearing some premiums. And he directly spoke up £90 million, which not only tested Sandetsi's ability but also had plans to bribe him. Sure enough, with the temptation of money, Sandetsi's efficiency has increased. Another day later, he notified Yang Luo that the price had been negotiated. Yang Luo asked, "What is the transaction price?" Sandetsi was in a good mood and said, £88 million. This also means that he earned a performance reward of £2 million for the company, and he should be able to receive at least £1 million himself. And Yang Luo also took the opportunity to ask him a question. "Mr. Woodward, are you willing to join Manchester City as the CEO?" Sandesi was taken aback and fell silent. After a while, he finally spoke up and said, "Mr. Yang, do you know that my father is a staunch Manchester United fan?" Yang Luo said, "What do you mean?" Sandetsi said word by word, "You'll have to pay extra." Chapter 3. Opposing Journalists and Opposing Fans. You are listening at novelfull.audio. December 12, 2002. Manchester City Club suddenly announced that mysterious American billionaire Yang Luo has acquired all shares of Manchester City Club for £88 million. Meanwhile, Yang Luo also took over the club and paid off several $1 million in debt, along with service fees paid to JP Morgan Chase, with an estimated expenditure of £100 million. This news immediately ignited the media. Yang Luo. Who is this person? Even the most knowledgeable person cannot find any information about him. It was not until Yang Luo and John Wardell appeared at the press conference that the reporters were surprised to find that Yang Luo had an oriental face and was also quite young. Probably another wealthy second generation, right? A question flashed through everyone's mind. After the brief hosting by the host, all the media eagerly began preparing to ask questions. A journalist stood up first and said, "Hello Mr. Yang, I'm Piers Smith from The Sun. I don't think everyone knows much about you. Can you briefly introduce yourself?" The Sun. Yang Luo furrowed his brows. Isn't this newspaper just fond of playing tricks? This is just a cliché, digging up some hot news. So he remained expressionless and said, "I am a Chinese American, 24 years old, unmarried." Piers Smith hesitated for a moment and asked reluctantly, "As an American, what drove you to come to the UK to acquire such a club?" Yang Luo glanced at him and said, "Love for football." Piers Smith was taken aback and had to sit down resentfully. I didn't expect this young man to be impeccable and unable to gather any useful information. At this moment, a reporter from the Times stood up and said, "Hello Mr. Yang, I am Kevin Johns from the Times. Have you ever been in the football industry before? And for what purpose did you acquire this club?" Xiao Luo did not hesitate. "I have never worked in any football-related field before. As for the goal, I want to build Manchester City into a prestigious team, even the greatest English team." This sentence immediately caused a commotion among the reporters on stage. At this moment, a Guardian journalist stood up. The Guardian is a local newspaper in Manchester. Naturally, many of the reporters are fans of the local team, and the person in front of them is a Manchester United fan. He stood up with a teasing expression on his face and said, "Mr. Xiao Luo, I think you may not be very familiar with English football. To become the greatest team in England, you need to surpass too many teams. Not to mention Manchester United, Arsenal, and Liverpool, but Blackburn and Aston Villa, that's enough for Manchester City to catch up for a while." Xiao Luo glanced at him and said, "Mr. Journalist, what is your name?" The journalist raised an eyebrow and said, "My name is David Jones." Xiao Luo smiled and said, "Mr. Jones, how old are you this year?" David Jones said, "I'm 31 years old this year." "What's the problem?" Xiao Luo glanced at him and said, "You are lucky enough to have enough time to witness the rise of Manchester City clubs. When you turn 50, you will surely believe my words today. On that day, I will invite you to witness all of this." David Jones nodded and said, "I also hope Mr. Yang is not just skilled at speaking." Xiao Luo said, "Your eloquence is your journalist's specialty. I'm only good at making my dreams come true." David Jones wanted to say something more, but was directly signaled by Xiao Luo to the next one. Then, another journalist stood up and said, "Mr. Yang, what will you use to support your idea? You know, building a wealthy family is not something that can happen overnight." Xiao Luo remained expressionless and said, "I have money." The journalist didn't expect him to give such an answer, and immediately didn't know how to answer the question. John Wardell on the side also showed a mix of tears and laughter. The young man was wealthy, but it was also too arrogant. However, he realized that Xiao Luo had directly given cash to buy the club, and he immediately understood his confidence. This kid seems to have plenty of money in his hands. If he can really invest real money and money into the club, perhaps he can really improve Manchester City's performance. Just to become the most successful club in England. He himself doesn't quite believe this statement. After the press conference, all the reporters could feel the uniqueness of this new boss. Perhaps it should be called arrogance. Especially The Guardian, their headline is, "Completely inexperienced, completely arrogant." In this report, they mercilessly criticized Xiao Luo, believing that he, as an outsider, will eventually lead Manchester City into the abyss. Among Manchester City fans, there is also constant opposition to Xiao Luo. Many fans surrounded the headquarters of Manchester City Football Club in protest against the acquisition. Especially the 1894 Group, a Manchester City fan organization, had the loudest protests and demanded that the club give an explanation. John Waddell, who was about to run away with the money, had to step forward and say, "Fans, you have to trust Mr. Xiao Luo. His financial strength is far stronger than ours, and he will give Manchester City a better future." A fan in his 30s walked up and said, "We want tradition, we want love, not cold capital." John Waddell recognized him as the famous Manchester City fan leader, Glenn Stone, and held a high position in the hearts of Manchester City fans. He knew he couldn't offend this person, so he patiently explained, "I love Manchester City Club like everyone else, but with my financial resources, I can't lead Manchester City further. I hope everyone can give Mr. Yang more trust." "How could I trust an outsider who has never been exposed to football?" said Glenn Stone loudly. Just then, a voice sounded, "Do you believe in me or not? Is it that important?" Glenn Stone was taken aback and turned to look at the person. I saw Xiao Luo walking over and saying, I bought Manchester City with real money and money. I didn't use any so-called financing methods to lure white wolves. That's 100 times stronger than you, a guy who only knows how to raise flags and shout slogans. Don't talk about things with any passion. I spent nearly £100 million to buy the club and pay off the debt. What did you do? Glenn Stone was taken aback and immediately speechless. Xiao Luo said again, true supporters should maintain enough patience with the team, rather than coming here to make big comments from the beginning. So, I hope everyone can give our management more time, and I guarantee that the club will be much better than you imagine. Glenn Stone's face was uncertain and he didn't speak. But most fans nodded, seemingly satisfied with Xiao Luo's statement. They themselves came to the club to ask for an attitude, and since Xiao Luo has already said so, they have naturally achieved their goal. Xiao Luo clapped his hands and said, then everyone should go back. I hope everyone continues to support Manchester City. After speaking, he turned around and left, leaving only Glenn Stone standing in the same place with a gloomy expression on his face. Chapter 4. The current situation of clubs. You are listening at novelfull.audio. At this time, there is still more than half a month before the winter transfer window opens, and before that, he needs to arrange the club's work first. Firstly, he needs to deal with the current chairman of the club, David Bernstein. This Bernstein is a loyal fan of Manchester City. He took over Manchester City when they fell into the third-tier league and successfully promoted them back to the Premier League within 2 years. In Xiao Luo's plan, he is an indispensable figure. Sandesi is responsible for business operations and handling team affairs, which will be Xiao Luo's right-hand man. And now that the club has just changed ownership, Xiao Luo also needs to rely on his prestige to stabilize the morale of the army and reduce staff turnover. However, David Bernstein frowned and said, Mr. Yang, I'm going to resign. Xiao Luo looked at him and said, Mr. Bernstein, Manchester City needs you. Bernstein nodded and said, I still have a deep affection for Manchester City, but now the team's development path seems to be somewhat different from mine, so. Xiao Luo naturally knew what he meant. He had previously paid attention to the history of Manchester City and knew that David Bernstein would soon resign, precisely because he did not align with the philosophy of then Manchester City coach Kevin Keegan. Bernstein believes that the team should not introduce too many famous players, as this would put a lot of financial pressure on the team. However, Keegan was obsessed with becoming famous football stars, which made Bernstein very dissatisfied. In the end, Bernstein resigned from the position of club president. Xiao Luo spoke up and said, Mr. Bernstein, I know you're unhappy with the club's signings. But now it's different because we share the same view. Bernstein was taken aback. Xiao Luo sincerely said, I will not allow Mr. Keegan to continue introducing a large number of famous and mature men. My main goal next is players under the age of 25. Bernstein looked carefully at Xiao Luo and fell into contemplation. Xiao Luo said again, moreover, Mr. Keegan does not fit my long-term plan, so he will not stay with Manchester City's head coach for too long. Bernstein's face twitched slightly, and his mismatch with Keegan's philosophy was the biggest reason for his resignation. After thinking for a moment, he said, then I would like to ask, Mr. Yang, what is your long-term plan? Xiao Luo said, become the top powerhouse in England. Bernstein paused for a moment and smiled bitterly, Mr. Yang, shouldn't we discuss something practical? Xiao Luo said seriously, do you think I'm joking? Bernstein was really stunned now. He looked at Xiao Luo seriously and said, Mr. Yang, this is not something that happens overnight. It will take at least 10 years of continuous cultivation. Xiao Luo smiled and said, I'm still young. Bernstein was stunned. After a while, he nodded and said, okay, I believe you. Xiao Luo smiled contentedly and said, Mr. Bernstein, I hope we have a pleasant cooperation. Bernstein also smiled and held his hand. With Bernstein's retention, the overall framework of the club will not undergo significant changes, and Xiao Luo's next task is to meet with the coaching team and players. Before the acquisition, he had already known about Manchester City's current team roster. Goalkeepers Schmeichel, Weaver, Nash, defenders Dunn, Javi, Austin, Hoy, Bischoff, Metamo, Ritchie, Nicholas Jensen, Wykens, midfielders Sun Jihai, Vivian Few, Hollick, Sack, Benibia, Negua, Belkovic, Tiato, Wright Phillips, Duffield, forwards Anelka, Goff, McKen, Huckby, Wanjop, and Keelan. Of course, there is also an old Harland who is about to retire. Yes, it's the old Harland who was abandoned by Roy Keane, the father of the cannibalistic child. Looking at this lineup, Xiao Luo couldn't help but curl his lips. What are these all about? The typical configuration of teams in the middle and lower reaches of the English Premier League. In the eyes of an old fan like him, this lineup is very lackluster. Old Schmeichel has a great reputation, but at the age of 39, he is about to retire and cannot be expected. Defenders such as Dunn, Austin, and Nicholas Jensen are still somewhat famous, but they cannot be called first-line players. As for the midfield line, Sun Jihai, who often appears on the right winger this season, is clearly more suitable for right backs. Captain Benabia is about to retire, Wright Phillips is still young, and as for Vivianfo, Xiao Luo couldn't help but sigh, so he had to go for a heart test. The most famous forwards are certainly Anelka and Vanjop, but it is unrealistic to expect them to compete for the championship. Although Goff is the biggest contributor to Manchester City's promotion, his abilities are clearly not sufficient on the Premier League stage. Moreover, their overall age is relatively old. Except for Dunn, Austin, Sun Jihai, Anelka, and Wanjop, who are still playing in their prime, all other key players are already in their 30s and urgently need to face a replacement. As for Vivian Few, Xiao Luo hopes that he can retire here. After all, football can never be higher than life and death. Overall, this lineup is almost entirely out of his plan. Of course, the least planned one is still their head coach, Mr. Kevin Keegan. This former Ballon d'Or winner clearly did not succeed as a coach, and his 442 tactics will eventually be eliminated, so Xiao Luo has no reason to keep him. Of course, in the middle of the season, he will not be busy with changing the head coach. After all, the team's record is relatively stable, and there is no reason to change the coach. So, after taking care of Bernstein, he made an appointment with Kevin Keegan. Kevin Keegan is 51 years old this year, considered one of the coaches, not tall, but he appears very energetic. After a brief exchange of greetings, Xiao Luo said, "Mr. Keegan, do you have any thoughts on the personnel of the club's first team now?" Keegan was also very direct. "Mr. Yang, do you want to recruit players in the winter transfer window?" Xiao Luo nodded and said, "I have this idea, but of course, it depends on whether there is a suitable opportunity." Keegan thought for a moment and said, "If possible, I would like to bring in a left winger and a forward." Xiao Luo politely asked, "Do you have a target candidate?" Keegan didn't hesitate. McManaman and Robbie Fowler. They are undoubtedly talented players. And McManaman's contract with Real Madrid is about to expire, which will be a very cost-effective deal. Xiao Luo's mind was buzzing as soon as he heard it. These two people are good, but one is older and the other loves to get hurt, which is really quite average in terms of cost-effectiveness. Moreover, it was precisely because of these two transactions in history that Manchester City's financial pressure rapidly increased, and Bernstein resigned as a result. Keegan, this old boy, is really this also strengthens Xiao Luo's determination to dismiss him next summer. Chapter 5. A Bucktooth Boy Paper. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. De co lois ara trong quatrin lay text. Chapter 6. There are flies. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. Bernstein's heart twitched. Paris, Bucktooth. Xiao Luo smiled and said, "It seems you've thought of someone." Bernstein said with some uncertainty, it can't be that Brazilian, can it? Xiao Luo smiled and said, who else can it be? Bernstein looked at him like a monster and said, he. May we be able to buy him? After all, he did so well in the World Cup. Xiao Luo said, but I have money. Bernstein sighed and said, in the world of football, you can't buy everything with money. Xiao Luo smiled and said, that's because they don't have enough money. The next day, Manchester City announced another news. The owner of the club, Xiao Luo, injected £150 million into the club. This news once again shocked the entire football world. People can't imagine how rich this mysterious Xiao Luo is. But only Xiao Luo knew that he had almost emptied his own pockets. My expectations before acquiring the club were still too optimistic. Because the exchange rate between the British pound and the US dollar is 1.56 to 1.56, I took out $400 million and ultimately converted it into just over £250 million except for acquiring the team for £100 million, the rest will be used for capital injection. This makes Xiao Luo a bit depressed. $400 million looks like a lot, but it's really a splash in this football world. It seems like we still need to earn more money. As soon as he thought of this, he habitually opened his stock account. Except for leaving $5 million to spend on my own, I have already bought stocks of a company with the remaining $100 million. Not Apple, not Microsoft, but NetEase. Because in his memory, the 2003 US stock market, whether it was Apple or Amazon, did not have as much growth as NetEase. After gradually closing his position and shorting Nasdaq stock index futures, he began to build his position on NetEase, and now all positions have been completed, with a cost price of about $4. Now, NetEase's stock has risen to $12, which means the market value of the stocks in their account has reached another $300 million. This finally made his mood clear again. He is not in a hurry to clear the position, but continues to hold it. This is just the beginning of the rise. Just as he was closing his stock account, a phone call came over. He picked up his phone and said, hello. A pleasant voice came from the phone. Brother Luo, where are you now? Xiao Luo unconsciously smiled. Fiona, I'm in Manchester. The girl over there let out a scream of surprise. What? Is that mysterious billionaire really you? Xiao Luo didn't hide anything from her. It's just me. Fiona exclaimed in surprise, Brother Luo, where did you get so much money? You must not do anything illegal. Xiao Luo smiled and said, don't worry, Fiona, every penny of my money is clean. Fiona finally calmed down and said, that's good. But how did you quietly earn so much money? How come I don't know at all? Xiao Luo said truthfully, I made money from stock trading. I'm lucky. With the money left by your uncle, it has increased hundreds of times in a few years, and now it's like this. Fiona was envious at the time and said, oh my goodness. You're actually the Buffett hiding next to me. When will you be back? Please treat me to dinner. Xiao Luo smiled. I'm very busy here recently. Why don't you come to Manchester to see me? I'll show you for a few days. Fiona said dejectedly, hey, I've been interning lately. And I've been very busy. Xiao Luo suddenly remembered that she was already a senior student, so he smiled and said, where are you interning now? Fiona spoke with a hint of pride, JP Chase. Xiao Luo was taken aback for a moment. This is still a colleague of Sandesi, so he encouraged, JP Chase is a top investment bank, and for you, this is a rare learning opportunity. Fiona coquettishly said, all right, I know. We're going to start preaching again. Xiao Luo sighed and said, I'm doing this for you. Fiona seemed to remember something and said, by the way, your message was told to me by Alex and Gary, and they are very likely to cause you trouble. Xiao Luo's face immediately turned cold upon hearing this. They too. What reason do they have to trouble me? I have nothing to do with them. Fiona sighed and said, I know, but there's an old saying in Huaxia that goes, the heart of defense is indispensable. Xiao Luo responded, okay, I will be careful. You can rest assured. Fiona said, okay, it's time for the tea break. I'll go back to work. Goodbye. Xiao Luo said, goodbye. After the two hung up the phone, Xiao Luo frowned. Fiona is the only sibling in the Lehman family who is close to her, and even maintains close contact with her after completely leaving the Lehman family. Perhaps it's because her mother is also from China, and both of them treat her very well. Unfortunately, only the two of them in the current Lehman family are still worth cherishing. Alex and Gary, on the other hand, are his nominal brothers and the biological sons of his adoptive father John Raymond. They have always been very hostile towards themselves and have been putting themselves in a difficult position since then. Even after leaving the Lehman family, they occasionally come to find fault. Especially since graduating from college and not having a serious job, they have done their utmost to mock themselves. Now they know that they have suddenly become so wealthy, it's not their style not to come and cause trouble. However, Xiao Luo didn't care at all. He never looked down upon the two playboys himself. But at this moment, his phone rang again. He frowned even tighter as he looked at the number. So he decisively hung up. But that number was very persistent and called again. Xiao Luo couldn't help but reminisce about the smartphones 10 years later, which could be directly added to the blacklist. He knows these two flies very well, and they will not stop until they disturb him. So he answered the phone. A frivolous male voice rang out, "Oh, Jamie Yang, still hanging up on my phone. Are you feeling guilty?" Jamie is the name of Xiao Luo in the Lehman family. Xiao Luo said coldly, "What do you want to do, Alex?" Alex sneered, "You shameless thief. You stole money from our Lehman family, how dare you show off so much?" Xiao Luo said coldly, "Please keep your mouth clean for me. I didn't take a penny more from your Lehman family. That $1 million is my foster father's tuition fee." Alex snorted coldly, $1 million. It's a big joke. If you only take $1 million, how could you have so much money to buy Manchester City? Do you think I'm a fool? Xiao Luo suddenly turned his anger into a smile and said, "You finally understand your intelligence level. Congratulations." Chapter 7. Brother is a broker. You are listening at novelfull.audio. In terms of cursing, 10 Alex is not a match for Xiao Luo. He was furious and said, "Okay, wait for me. I will definitely make you spit out all the stolen money." Xiao Luo remained calm and said, "Come on, I'm waiting for you." Alex snorted coldly, "Wait for the investigation." Speaking, he hung up the phone. Xiao Luo smiled nonchalantly, as this kind of fly would not affect his mood at all. Of course, if he dares to bully himself, Xiao Luo sneered. 2 days later, Xiao Luo called Bernstein and boarded the plane to Paris together. Bernstein had already called Paris sports director Le Corny in advance, and Le Corny's response was that we are willing to listen to the quotation. Xiao Luo remembers that Paris Saint-Germain is currently in a financial crisis, otherwise he wouldn't have sold the Bucktooth guy to Barcelona at a low price in the summer of 2003. Nowadays, he is trying to catch up with this Brazilian before Barcelona. After getting off the plane, the two of them did not stop, but went directly to Paris Saint-Germain club. At this time, Ligue 1 is in the winter break period, and many players have gone on vacation, but the club staff can only continue to work with their buttocks sticking out. As soon as the two arrived at Paris Saint-Germain club, a young and beautiful staff member greeted them. "May I ask if they are Mr. Yang and Mr. Bernstein from Manchester City Club?" Bernstein's eyes lit up and he said, "Hello beautiful lady, we are from Manchester City Club." As he spoke, he wanted to hold on to the girl's fair little hand. Xiao Luo couldn't help but roll his eyes. "Bernstein, you're almost 60. Don't be so sleazy." Okay, the staff shook hands with them generously and then led them to Le Corny's room. Luke Corney was already sitting upright in the office. When he saw the two of them, he immediately stood up with a smile on his face and said, "Hello Mr. Yang and Mr. Bernstein." In his eyes, both of them are gods of wealth. Paris Saint-Germain today is not Paris Saint-Germain a few years later. They have fallen into a disadvantage in the arms race against teams such as Lyon, and the club has therefore fallen into a financial crisis. And in today's clubs, the most valuable one is undoubtedly the cute Bucktooth classmate, so he knows that Paris will definitely not be able to keep him. But he must find a good mother-in-law for his lovely Bucktooth and collect more dowry along the way. Although Manchester City is not a big club, they have £150 million. This dowry cannot be given in full. A few people exchanged pleasantries before taking their seats separately. Bernstein spoke up and said, "Mr. Corney, I believe you also know the purpose of our trip. I wonder how much your club is willing to sell Ronaldinho for." Corney cleared his throat and showed a warm smile. "Both of you know that Ronaldinho is the treasure of our team's home, which is quite important to our team. It can be said that he is priceless in my heart." He paused, blinked his big eyes, and looked at the two with innocent eyes. Xiao Luo looked at him and said, "Mr. Corney, if I remember correctly, your club seems to have some financial issues now." Corney's face suddenly changed and he gave him a mournful look. "Why don't you, an Easterner, talk about tricks?" Xiao Luo also smiled and said, "So, Mr. Corney, could you give us a psychological price range?" We came with full sincerity. Corney showed a pensive expression, as if making a very difficult decision. After a while, he lifted his head and spoke with a reluctant expression, €50 million. Bernstein immediately said, "Mr. Corney, do you seem to have a bit of a lion's mouth? He's only 20.2 years old, and this price is very reasonable," said Corney firmly. Bernstein said, "This summer's champion Ferdinand is only €46 million, and although Ronaldinho is good, he is just a supernova." Corney said, "He's a future Ballon d'Or level player. This price is not high." So the two of them began a heated discussion on the price aspect. Xiao Luo remembers that during the summer window of 2003, Ronaldinho's transfer fee was €25 million. However, the buyer is Barcelona, and the bargaining power of luxury clubs is much stronger than that of Manchester City today. So the acceptable price in his heart is between €35 million and €40 million. Sure enough, after more than 10 minutes, the negotiations between Bernstein and Corney reached this stage. Bernstein offered €34 million, while Corney asked for €40 million. Just as they began to fall into the final deadlock, Xiao Luo spoke up, €37 million, to be paid in full at once. Corney suddenly felt a sense of joy in his heart. €37 million was already a good price, and he didn't expect the boss to choose to pay it all at once, which was a huge benefit for their finances. He immediately called the chairman, Griel, and Griel had no objections to this transaction. In the end, both sides reached an agreement at the club level. The next step is the players' willingness. Xiao Luo knew very well that this was the most difficult level. As a current superstar, Ronaldinho has shone brightly in the World Cup in Japan and South Korea. Will he be interested in transferring to Manchester City, a club in the middle and lower reaches of the Premier League? Xiao Luo's only reliance is on those stinky money. But now our happy Bucktooth boy is on vacation in Brazil, so Corney called him to see if he can come back and talk about the transfer. As a result, after a long phone call, someone answered the phone and said, "This is Roberto Assis. Mr. Director, may I ask if there is anything I can do?" This Roberto Assis is Ronaldinho's brother and also his agent. Corney immediately said, "Roberto, there is a club coming to offer Ronaldinho. I hope you can come back and talk about his transfer." Xiao Luo, who was standing beside him, was moved by the legendary agent brother of Ronaldinho. If he comes back to negotiate, it seems much easier. After all, this guy is quite unreliable. He once got a fake passport for Ronaldo to enter Paraguay and was even detained. However, in the end, Xiao Luo benefited from misfortune and achieved an astonishing achievement in prison, which was to win the Golden Prisoner Award that no top superstar has ever won today. Perhaps, such a person can be moved with money. As expected, Roberto immediately chose to fly back from Brazil to Paris as soon as he heard of a transfer opportunity. Chapter 8. Dealing with Xiao Luo. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Young Luo and Bernstein stayed in Paris for a day. The next morning, the dusty Roberto rushed back to Paris. He didn't care about resting and came straight to the club. After receiving the news, Young Luo and Bernstein immediately rushed to the club and met in the club's reception hall. This lucky brother with a good younger brother has a slight resemblance to Xiao Luome's eyes, but in terms of appearance, he is slightly stronger than his younger brother. After chatting with him for a while, Young Luo couldn't help but say, "Mr. Assis, didn't your brother come back with him?" Roberto waved his hand nonchalantly and said, "My younger brother said, just leave it to me to handle it completely. He's still on vacation in Brazil." Young Luo couldn't help but roll his eyes in his heart. This little Luo really has a big heart, as this was already a matter between Manchester City and the players. Leconi wisely said, "Sorry everyone, I happen to have some things to attend to. Let's talk about it first. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me directly." After speaking, he waved his hand to the three and left the reception hall. Seeing that the unrelated parties had already left, Young Luo spoke up and said, "Mr. Assis, we would like to know if you and your brother have any thoughts on transferring to our Manchester City club." Roberto's face showed a puzzled expression and he said, "Mr. Young, as you know, Ronaldinho from our family has lofty aspirations, and a top club is his next goal. And Manchester City club." Young Luo rolled his eyes in his heart. "If you don't like our club, how could you eagerly run back from Brazil? You're just saying these things to raise the price. The family members of these football stars who work as agents value money the most. Far away, isn't there still an Anelka in my team now? So the best way to deal with people like them is to give them money. However, since he was playing tricks on himself, I certainly couldn't just follow him. So he spoke up and said, 'It seems that you are not interested in joining Manchester City. Since that's the case, let's disturb you.' After speaking, he was about to get up and leave. Roberto suddenly became anxious. He just showed his high posture, but he didn't expect the other side to directly withdraw the steps for him. As soon as they left, they eagerly ran back from Brazil to Paris, which was like a fool, wasn't it? So he quickly spoke up and said, "Mr. Yang, what I want to express is that Manchester City Club has proven your determination to become a powerhouse with your sincerity, so we are willing to negotiate with you." Young Luo exchanged a tacit glance with Bernstein, and their mouths curved slightly upwards. After all, not being a professional agent can still be easily manipulated. Next is the mutual tug of war between Bernstein and Roberto. However, Young Luo and Bernstein also know that it is impossible to bring in players of this level without much bleeding. In the end, they reached an agreement and Ronaldinho's weekly salary was set at £65,000. Don't underestimate this number. The top salary in the Premier League now is only £90,000 for Roy Keane. Moreover, Manchester City also paid a signing fee of €2 million. This also means that Manchester City paid a total of £26 million to sign Ronaldinho. This is almost a king-level price. But Young Luo knew that he definitely made a lot of money. A player of this level who can win is considered to have burned high incense. In order to avoid a long dream, Bernstein signed a contract with Paris Saint-Germain that day, and then asked Roberto to call Ronaldinho from Brazil to Manchester to arrange a medical examination for him. After the physical examination was completed, both parties officially signed a 5-year contract. However, at Roberto's request, Ronaldinho added a conditional termination clause to his contract. Since 2005, teams participating in the Champions League can buy Ronaldinho for €80 million. Xiao Luo also knows the current positioning of Manchester City, so he did not object to this termination clause. Furthermore, Xiao Luo's peak period was not that long, and he had originally planned to cash out at the high point. At the moment when both sides finished writing, Xiao Luo finally breathed a sigh of relief. The Bucktooth guy next to him also put down his pen and spoke to Xiao Luo, "Mr. Yang, since there's nothing else, then I'll go back to Brazil." Xiao Luo sighed helplessly, as he had promised him before that he could enjoy the entire vacation. But I didn't expect him to have such a big heart that even if he postponed reporting to his new unit, he still had to enjoy life first. But if he doesn't do this, he's not that Xiao Luo anymore. Bernstein also looked at Xiao Luo helplessly, feeling a headache. "Is this Brazilian reliable?" Xiao Luo smiled at him and said, "Don't worry, Ronaldinho is a true genius." On December 23, 2002, Manchester City officially announced that the team had signed Paris Saint-Germain player Ronaldinho for €37 million. This news once again shook the entire European football scene. Since the World Cup in Korea and Japan, Ronaldinho has attracted the attention of many top clubs, but it was unexpected that Manchester City took the lead and took him into their possession. And this is only Xiao Luo's 11th day at the club. This has made many people realize that this new boss is really not for fun. At the press conference, Bernstein was full of energy. Signing Ronaldinho is a significant transaction, which means the new Manchester City has taken their first step. The reporter asked, "What is Manchester City's next strategy in the transfer market after this transaction?" Bernstein smiled and said, "As long as there is a chance, we will continue to attack." Another journalist asked, "Can you reveal your goals?" Bernstein gave a mysterious smile and said, "Just wait and watch the news." The next day, a reporter interviewed Arsenal head coach Wenger about this matter. "Mr. Wenger, what do you think of this deal?" Wenger frowned and said, "Ronaldinho is a true genius. Manchester City made a great deal." The reporter then asked, "What kind of impact do you think Xiao Luo's joining will bring to the entire Premier League?" Wenger shook his head and said, "Money is a powerful force that can have a significant impact on the entire Premier League. But I'm not sure if this impact is good or bad." A reporter also interviewed the old man with a red nose and said, "Sir Ferguson, what do you think of this deal?" Ferguson smiled and said, "This may be the first step for Manchester City to get back on track. However, this deal is really too expensive. After all, Mr. Xiao Luo may be too rich." The reporter asked, "Mr. Ferguson, how long do you think Manchester City will be able to challenge Manchester United?" Ferguson gave a mysterious smile and said, "Football is round." Chapter 9. Seeing Your Stupidity. You are listening at novelfull.audio. At this time, Xiao Luo was at the airport in Manchester. Yesterday, he received a notice from the California police requesting him to return to California to cooperate with the investigation. The people of the Lehman family have indeed reported the case, accusing themselves of embezzling family assets. Xiao Luo sneered, "These mediocre people only eat, drink, and play all day long, but also stare at themselves to find fault." Although he could directly find a lawyer himself, he decided not to see their deflated expressions, so he decided to go back on his own. 20 minutes before boarding, he sipped a cup of coffee, but also felt bored. Nowadays, mobile phones are just phones, and there is no such thing as watching videos. Just then, his phone rang. Fiona's voice rang out. "Brother Luo, I heard that Alex and Gary have called the police." Xiao Luo nodded and said, "It's just a clown, I'm not worried at all. It's just that I have to go back to California, which is a bit of a delay for me." Fiona said, "When will you be back?" "I'll pick you up at the airport." Xiao Luo thought for a moment and said, "About 12 hours later." Fiona said, "Okay, I'll pick you up at the airport then." Shortly after hanging up the phone, Xiao Luo boarded a plane to California. 12 hours later, he appeared at the airport in California. Among the people picking up the plane, he saw Fiona with a tall figure at a glance. Today, she is wearing a long trench coat, with slim-fitting jeans that make her long legs look even more slender. Her long black hair and fair skin make her stand out in the crowd. As soon as Fiona saw him, she excitedly waved her arm and said, "Brother Luo, here, here." She is using Chinese. Due to her mother being Chinese, her Chinese is also quite fluent, and she only communicates with Yang Luo in Chinese. Yang Luo walked over to her with a smile, and Fiona took his arm and said, "Let's go, millionaire." He couldn't help but laugh and said, "How old are you? Hold my hand." Fiona looked up arrogantly and said, "What's wrong? You're my brother." Yang Luo said, "In theory, I am no longer your brother. I have no legal relationship with the Lehman family anymore." Fiona instead tightened her grip and said, "So what? I'm willing." Yang Luo had no choice but to let her hold her arm, and the two of them walked to the parking lot like this. There was an old Beetle parked in the parking lot, and Yang Luo knew it was Fiona's car. He couldn't help but smile wryly and said, "Can't you just change cars? I can't get into it anymore." Fiona pouted and said, "I'm not as rich as you." Yang Luo said, "How about I change your car?" Fiona shook her head firmly and said, "I won't do it. When I make money, I'll trade it myself." Yang Luo knew that she had a stubborn personality, so he didn't say anything more. It was already evening when Fiona pulled him to a Chinese restaurant and said, "Monopoly, how about treating me to a meal?" Since Fiona is also studying at Stanford University, they used to often come to this restaurant together for meals. Yang Luo smiled and said, "We can go eat something more expensive, you don't have to save me money." Fiona arrogantly glanced at him and walked in first. The owner of this shop immediately recognized the two of them and greeted them with a smile. Fiona's level of appearance can indeed leave a deep impression on others. Her appearance made everyone in the store couldn't help but take a few more glances at her. Unlike other mixed-race women, her face seems to have more distinct traces of Chinese culture, more exquisite than top European and American beauties. If analogies are necessary, she is more like Sophie Marceau with fairer skin and more delicate features. She casually found a table and sat down, skillfully ordering a few signature dishes from the store without asking Yang Luo for any opinion. Yang Luo shrugged at the sight, as he was already used to it. The dishes were quickly served, and the two of them were not polite and began to feast on them. After finishing his meal, Fiona took him to his residence and said, "I'll go to the police station with you tomorrow." Yang Luo quickly refused, "What are you going to do? After all, you are still a member of the Lehman family." Fiona snorted coldly, "Do you know why I would rather intern at JP Morgan Chase than at Lehman Brothers?" Yang Luo was taken aback. Fiona waved her hand and drove away with her own Beetle. The next morning, Fiona arrived downstairs at Yang Luo's house on time and brought him to the police station together. Due to the lack of evidence from the police station, Yang Luo only cooperated with the investigation. After the two of them arrived at the police station, the officer in charge of receiving them led them into a room similar to a conference room. Fiona couldn't help but look around and said, "This is my first time at the police station." Yang Luo shrugged and said, "It's like I've been here before." The two couldn't help but smile at each other. At this moment, a middle-aged white police officer pushed the door in and saw the two of them still jokingly smiling. He couldn't help but frown and say, "What are you doing?" Yang Luo glanced at him and said, "You asked me to cooperate with the investigation, and I came very cooperatively. Is there any problem?" The white police officer snorted coldly, "Someone reported that your huge assets come from unknown sources and suspected you of illegally stealing their family's property. If this is true, you will face more than 15 years in prison." Yang Luo sighed and said, "They have no reason to suspect me of framing me. Can you summon and investigate me without evidence?" The white police officer said coldly, I asked you to cooperate with the investigation. I asked you to provide evidence, not to ask me back. Xiao Luo's heart was clear that this white police officer must have some connection with the Lehman family, otherwise he wouldn't have this attitude. At the thought of this, he also turned cold and said, providing evidence is possible, but I need to confront the person who reported it face to face. The white police officer sneered. Coincidentally, the informant has already arrived at the police station, and they also want to see what you call evidence. As he spoke, he turned around and walked out of the room, bringing in two white men. As soon as he saw them, Xiao Luo's face immediately turned cold. The person who came was Alex and Gary Lehman, the two biological sons of his adoptive father John Lehman. From the moment Xiao Luo arrived at the Lehman family, the two of them targeted him everywhere. Even after Xiao Luo left the Lehman family, they never let them go. As soon as Alex saw Xiao Luo and Fiona, he immediately showed a strange smile and said, "Oh, why is our Oriental princess also here? Do you still like to hang out with this useless thief?" Fiona's face showed anger and she said, "You guys are useless. Brother Luo is 10,000 times stronger than you." Gary Lehman sneered, still defending him now. "If he's proven to be a thief later, how can you speak for him?" Xiao Luo looked at them like a fool and said, "I called you in just to let you witness your own foolishness with your own eyes." Chapter 10. Smash Face. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As soon as they said this, Alex and Gary were stunned for a moment, then looked at each other and burst into laughter. Alex sneered, "Do you think I'm stupid? When we kicked you out, we gave you $1 million. How could you make 4 or 5 billion in just 6 or 7 years? You didn't steal our money, who would believe that?" The white police on the side couldn't help but sneer, as if they were about to take down the giant thief. Xiao Luo sighed and said, "Being foolish is not scary, but being foolish without realizing it is the most scary." As he spoke, he took out a stack of paper from his bag and said, "I only received $1 million. However, I'm lucky. In the European Championship that year, I invested some money in gambling. This is a record of my orders placed by a gambling company." As he spoke, he spread it out one by one and said, "The records on each stroke are very clear. Police officer, I made bets in Las Vegas, and the gambling there is not illegal, is it?" White police officers stared intently at every gambling ticket, which featured the trademark of the largest gambling company in Las Vegas, as well as their unique anti-counterfeiting logo. Obviously, each of these lottery tickets is genuine and effective. And Xiao Luo carefully arranged them all according to the date, recording how Xiao Luo won $5 million. Looking at them one by one, everyone present couldn't help but have a thought in their hearts. This person is also very lucky. Alex felt inexplicably uneasy in his heart, and he couldn't help but swallow his saliva. This is only $5 million, what's the rest? Xiao Luo sighed and the mockery in his eyes became more and more obvious. Next, I will make you completely give up. As he spoke, he took out another stack of paper from his backpack and said, after earning $5 million from gambling, I threw myself into the stock market. He began flipping through the first page and said, I bought $2 million worth of Apple stock and took another $2 million for the Nasdaq stock index futures. He paused. In less than 4 years, the market value of my stock account reached $100 million. Then, when the internet foam burst, I decided to short, expanding my assets to $500 million. As he spoke, he pushed the transaction records and fund flow to them and said, these are the transaction records and fund flow printed by the securities company for me, with their company seal on them. If you don't believe it, you can go to the securities company to verify. Alex and Gary's expressions became incredulous. They flipped through the records bit by bit, their faces slowly turning pale. These transaction records are very real, and Xiao Luo cannot tell such a low-level lie. This also means that he has never stolen a penny from the Lehman family. That is to say, their alarm was completely a joke. Now, they no longer had their previous arrogance, and the two looked at each other, unsure of what to do. But Xiao Luo didn't plan to just let them go like this. "Police officer, does this prove my innocence?" The white police officer instinctively nodded. Xiao Luo said again, "Police officer, I would like to ask, what kind of legal responsibility should they be held accountable for such unfounded false accusations and defamation?" The white police officer's face also changed. Xiao Luo shrugged and said, "It seems you don't understand either. It's okay, I've already hired a lawyer." As he spoke, he took out his phone and dialed a phone number. "Sherlock lawyer, could you please come to the San Francisco Police Department? I have a case on my end that I need your help with." Then he slowly tidied up all the materials on the table and said, "I have to wait for my lawyer to come now, and you can also find your lawyer." The white police officer's face also looked ugly. He wanted to say something, but Xiao Luo stood up and pulled Fiona out of the conference room. Fiona's eyes were filled with admiration at this moment. "Brother Luo, you were so handsome just now." Xiao Luo smiled and said, "They're hitting my gun." 15 minutes later, a middle-aged man in a suit and leather shoes appeared at the police station. Xiao Luo welcomed him and said, "Hello, Mr. Sherlock." The lawyer smiled and said, "Mr. Yang, let me handle the rest." After speaking, he found the white police officer and said, "Officer, are you responsible for taking over this report? I have reason to believe that these two Mr. Lehman are suspected of defaming my client, Mr. Xiao Luo. I am now ready to pursue their legal responsibilities on behalf of my client in accordance with the law." Alex and Gary trembled all over. This defamation charge is big or small? If this lawyer and Xiao Luo were to bite and not let go, at least this Christmas is impossible to spend at home. At this moment, 3 people hurriedly walked into the police station. The person in charge is a middle-aged woman. Although her figure has changed, she still wears a pink windbreaker and looks a bit out of sync. When Alex and Gary saw her, they immediately seemed to see a savior. "Mom." The person who came was their mother, Xiao Luo's former nominal foster mother Chris Lehman. She gave Xiao Luo a cold glare and quickly approached her 2 sons, saying, "Don't worry, I'm here." The 2 people behind her also walked up. These are the 2 lawyers brought by Chris. But after a brief understanding of the situation, their faces looked a bit unpleasant. They whispered to Chris Lehman, "Madam, we believe the best way to resolve this matter is to reconcile." Chris Lehman frowned and said, "Why?" One of them said, "In the current situation, as long as the other party insists on pursuing justice, although your 2 sons are unlikely to be imprisoned, the corresponding compensation is indispensable. Moreover, during the litigation period, once the media finds out, it will be very detrimental to the reputation of the Lehman family." Chris Lehman frowned and couldn't help but look at Xiao Luo, with an undisguised expression of disgust on her face. Xiao Luo didn't flinch and just stared at her tightly. Since his first visit to the Lehman family, she has been very disgusted with herself. If it weren't for her adoptive father, she would never have allowed herself to stay at the Lehman family for a second. As for the various differences in treatment towards oneself in daily life, it is even more common. Looking back now, it is all the indelible pain in Xiao Luo's heart before. So, he is disgusted with this woman in his heart. He also knew that it was unlikely to have a significant impact on those 2 goods this time, but he was waiting for this woman to bow down to him with those 2 goods. Chris Lehman's face was uncertain at this moment, and finally, she couldn't help but say to one of the lawyers, "Can you help me ask him how much money he wants to reach a settlement?" The lawyer walked over and said, "Mr. Yang, may I ask how much money do you need to reconcile?" Xiao Luo smiled and said, 100 million pounds.